did not foresee the events that opened the door to the exploitation of a new resource, shale oil. An unprecedented boom propelled the United States into the ranks of the world's largest oil producers. Consumers benefited from cheaper prices. This time, it was the oil-producing countries that bore the brunt. The price of oil collapsed. Between June 2014 and January 2016, the price of a barrel of crude declined by 70%. The three major producers, the United States, Russia and Saudi Arabia, continue to vie for power and control. Shifting strategies and alliances help turn the global economic and geopolitical order on its head. At the same time, a global transition to renewable energy is underway. Oil is still king, but is its rule now drawing to a close? Here, in the heart of Paris, the Kepler company keeps a sharp eye on the global oil economy.
Ouais, salut Marco, ça va?
Alexandre Andloyer is an oil market analyst.
Kepler released numbers showing Saudi Arabia's exports are rising a bit and Venezuela is still falling. Yes, about 100,000 barrels a month. So I'd say that's having an impact right now.
In September 2012, early in his career, Andloyer published a study that predicted a major drop in the price of oil. Many experts disagreed.
In 2012, the price of oil was $100 a barrel. Everyone thought it could only go up to $200 a barrel. When I said oil prices would collapse, they thought I was crazy.
In January 2014, Andloyer's predictions began making headlines. We're facing a technological revolution that could change the world as we know it today. Black gold, a recurring theme in the modern American dream. The country's oil taps seemed endless and oil exports boomed. The Industrial Revolution helped make the United States a world power. But to maintain this standing, new sources of oil would need to be found.
One of the most colourful visits to the presidential cruiser was that of the ruler of Saudi Arabia, King Ibn Saud.
In February 1945, the Americans and the Saudis meet on board the USS Quincy to discuss oil.
There was a bilateral security pact, which is what the Saudis called it. They said to the Americans, "We have an ocean of oil, and will assure that you have a secure supply. In return, we ask you to ensure our security."
From Washington to Suez is a long way, but understanding each other's problems brings East and West together for a better world.
The friendship would soon prove to be a rocky one. In 1960, the oil exports of the Middle East joined with Venezuela to form a cartel that would defend their interests and stabilize prices. From that point on, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, would be a powerful force.
Son premier grand coup, l'OPEP le frappe en 1973. Nous sommes au lendemain de la guerre israélo-arabe du Kippour. 5 pays producteurs de pétrole décrètent un embargo sur les pays alliés d'Israël et multiplient le prix du pétrole par 4. Le baril passe à $11, c'est le premier choc pétrolier.
Worried about its own oil supply, the United States halted its exports. The carefree years when a tank of fuel cost next to nothing had ended. Oil had become a political weapon.
By the 90s, we'd forgotten that oil crisis. People were euphoric. They thought everything would be fine, that we had the geopolitical situation under control, and that we would retain a firm grip on the Middle East. Later, we realized that wasn't the case, but at the time, that's what people believed.
The terror attack on September 11, 2001 was a profound shock to the US government and its people. "15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals.
After September 11, we saw the close relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States begin to disintegrate somewhat. But the U.S. was very dependent on oil imports from the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia. We began to see American companies such as ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Texaco shift from Saudi Arabia to Africa, which at the time was still relatively untapped. They focused on Angola, Nigeria, and the other countries along the Gulf of Guinea.
In the wake of 9/11, the US began to pursue a new oil supply strategy. Africa was just the beginning.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours.
Iraq held nearly 10% of the world's oil reserves. The US had taken another step in the direction of reducing its dependence on Saudi oil.
In any conflict, your fate will depend on your actions. Do not destroy oil wells, a source of wealth that belongs to the Iraqi people.
The Americans would prove to have a keen interest in Iraq's oil fields. The weapons of mass destruction supposedly possessed by Saddam Hussein were little but a pretext. In 2003, oil cost $30 a barrel. The wolves of Wall Street got into the act. The big American banks had caught the scent of black gold, which had become an attractive commodity on the global market.
My personal trading experience is in oil, but at Morgan Stanley at the time on my trading floor, we traded all commodities. So it included agriculture, metals, freight, so shipping, natural gas, power, all commodities. The entire commodities market was booming and demand was fantastic for oil worldwide, and China in particular and Asia were growing a lot. So very, very positive.
Did you make a lot of money?
Yes, a lot of money was made. And because we had new market players. And so then that creates more opportunity.
Over the next 3 years, the price of oil more than doubled.
This development of this banking business originated with American investment banks. We need to ask, are these still actually banks, or are they perhaps financial institutions that engage in trading? Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley became major players. There were years when Goldman Sachs earned over $1 billion from commodities trading.
The financiers, the banks, the speculators realized that oil, especially crude oil, was a fungible good, a kind of substitute for money, if you will. The most fungible good is money. which is traded around the world. Next come crude oil, petroleum, and gasoline. It's also bought and sold all over the world. The banks used oil as a way to engage in speculation.
The financial industry had free rein. They traded in futures, legally binding contracts, without ever seeing so much as a drop of oil.
The volatility in oil prices is directly related to speculation. It has nothing to do with the actual product anymore. Between the time when the crude oil is extracted and when it arrives at the refinery, its price will have tripled. About 30 intermediaries will have all taken their cut. It's completely crazy. For me, as a poor industrialist, this is the key point. Fortunes have been made without any product behind it, simply by means of trading.
The rise in oil prices was not only due to speculation. Global demand from emerging and threshold countries and from China was also a driving force.
It was very exciting because it was a new world. And Asia was developing so much, and that was just very exciting that the entire world was growing. That was wonderful. But
in 2008, the price of oil hit a new record.
When the oil price even went above $100, it was crazy. It was so exciting. And, you know, it went up, and then it went straight down again, and then it went higher again. So it was very exciting, but still we had buyers. So long as someone wants to buy the oil, it's okay.
Meanwhile, American engineers and entrepreneurs were hatching a new plan to exploit the immense oil and gas reserves in shale and other rock formations. While conventional oil deposits are for the most part easily accessible, shale oil is trapped in rock so dense that it must be fractured to extract it. The process is expensive, but at a price of over $100 a barrel, it becomes profitable.
With the start of shale extraction from unconventional reserves, the U.S. sensed an opportunity. In the early years, the U.S. was an oil exporter. Later, it became an importer and signed agreements with the Gulf countries. But now they thought, maybe we can escape the clutches of those bothersome countries in the Middle East.
The Permian Basin in the heart of Texas contains an immense oil reserve, estimated at some 35 billion barrels. The first oil rigs went up here in the early 1920s. In the city of Midland, the childhood home of George W. Bush, oil is king.
I think with the development of the technology for its fracking and the ability to get it out, I think the Permian Basin was probably ready before any other regions. Like I said, the Eagle Ford Shale, it's not a new development in Barnett Shale, but the shale play here, you have so many advanced individuals around here, and as for geologists and engineering groups, they were ready. They were pretty well ready for the play around here.
We have, in some areas, over 20 different pays that are stacked on top of one another. This resource here is enormous. You think of the size of the Permian Basin, it's bigger than the state of Alabama. That's how big it is.
Alexandra Andloyer came here in 2014. The shale oil revolution was at its peak.
It was in full swing. During the first half of the year, the price was at $100 a barrel. Drilling rigs were everywhere. Everyone was euphoric. There was a real estate boom. It was a true oil rush. Structurally speaking, shale oil extraction is a completely new and different industry. With just $5 million, you can start extracting oil within 3 to 6 months. At oil reserves elsewhere in the world, it takes several $100 million and a much longer time, between 2 and 4 years. It was very surprising how quickly things went here and how little money was needed.
The shale oil windfall allowed the Americans to cut oil imports. As a result, global demand stalled. There was a glut on the market. 400 million barrels of oil with no buyer.
The 2014 oil crisis wasn't triggered by the Americans. It was triggered by the Saudis. It had a political dimension. The U.S. had long been an ally of the Saudi monarchy. They had an understanding with the Saudis that they would turn the tap on and off in order to regulate market forces.
But the Saudis had no plans to throttle production. Instead, they continued flooding the market, hoping to push prices down. At under $70 a barrel, they assumed the American fracking industry would falter. Oil went into free fall.
L'effondrement des cours du pétrole a enfin un impact sur le prix de notre essence. Alors un impact très limité en France, on le sait, du fait des taxes. Mais dans le reste du monde et en particulier aux États-Unis, c'est la fête. L'OPEC doit prendre des décisions sur sa production car pour les pays producteurs, cette baisse est tout simplement une catastrophe.
A high-stakes game of poker began. In the first round, Saudi Arabia urged its OPEC partners, the all-powerful cartel of oil-producing countries, to maintain their production. Low oil prices were crucial to their strategy.
In the summer of 2014, the Saudis decided to send oil prices plummeting, to use high costs to push frackers and other producers out of the market. We were surprised and thought, maybe they know the shale industry is vulnerable.
After a 5-hour negotiation, OPEC conceded the Saudi position. They agreed to flood the market and drown out the American producers. Oil prices continued to fall. Russia, the world's second-largest oil exporter, stood back and watched. The country is not a member of OPEC, and it had a somewhat different take on the American shale revolution.
The technology that permitted the development of shale oil and gas extraction was developed in the Schlumberger laboratory, located in the city of Novosibirsk. The development of this technology took place on Russian territory. We didn't think fracking would be implemented on such a large scale. But it didn't surprise us, because the United States and Canada have significant hydrocarbon reserves.
Unlike the United States, Russia doesn't extract its shale oil. But even though Russia was not surprised by the US fracking revolution, Moscow did not anticipate the collapse of oil prices.
In 2014, all the Russian officials and the oil and gas analysts believed that prices would not fall below $80 a barrel. We didn't think the Saudis would risk that, since it would make it difficult to maintain a balanced budget. Even the Russian president said that the world economy would collapse if prices dipped below the $80 mark.
But the price kept dropping. As the holiday season approached, Moscow grew worried that the plummeting price of oil could send the country into a deep recession. The downward plunge continued. The major players in the US fracking industry were working on a strategy to co-opt the Saudi gamble. With no end in sight to the drop in prices, who would fold first?
The Saudi decision unleashed a shock wave. It had an almost immediate impact on the shale industry. There were massive layoffs in the United States. Everyone cut costs.
The price hit rock bottom at $26 a barrel.
$26 was a serious crisis. Some major frackers continued to believe a rebound was coming. They had the financial resources to withstand the low prices, which they figured would last only a few more weeks or months. And they were right.
I don't think anybody was actually panicking during the time, actually, working ourselves back up. And everybody was still watching the price of the oil, watching it pretty close. And I forget what the exact price was.
Every oil-producing country was affected by the crisis. But Norway had an advantage. Western Europe's largest oil producer was observing the poker game from a safe distance and preparing for the future.
For many years, much of Norway's revenue came from oil and gas exports to countries in the region. Before the crisis hit, our government had already decided to diversify the Norwegian economy. We needed a broader basis which would make us stronger. Concentrating all our growth in one single source of revenue would make us too vulnerable.
The plummeting price of oil also had an impact on public perception.
In a certain sense, it had a positive effect, at least here in Norway. It helped us move forward in the discussion about climate change, and the oil companies grew a bit more open to alternative solutions. More and more citizens and politicians realized that perhaps we shouldn't believe what the oil companies were saying. Every resource is finite, even if they try to launch all these crazy projects. That helped trigger a shift.
Oil extraction began in Norway in 1971. In 1990, the country established an oil fund to invest its petroleum revenues. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, which has more than $1 trillion in assets, helps finance social expenditures. In November 2017, the fund announced it was considering divesting from oil and gas, saying the country already had enough exposure to this high-risk industry. But so far, no decision's been made.
We're not claiming that demand has peaked and oil won't be worth anything anymore. We're saying we don't know. The price of oil might go back up, but it could also go down. We're working on a strategy to prepare for the future.
In another sign of the times, the Norwegian oil company Statoil decided to rebrand. It's been renamed Equinor to signal its shift to a broad-based energy company.
For several years, in our projections and scenarios, we've predicted a peak in both demand and oil production around the year 2030. But this is all very uncertain. For this reason, we believe that renewable energies will play a role in the future.
The Norwegian company plans to invest $200 million in renewable energy by 2022. Equinor developed the world's first commercial floating wind farm off the coast of Scotland. The high wind farm is linked to a battery storage system. But Norway has not abandoned oil and continues to issue exploration licenses. The oil market remains mired in crisis. Climate change has become an increasingly important issue on the global agenda.
Je regarde la salle, je n'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
Since then, President Donald Trump has announced his own energy policy.
We are pursuing American energy dominance, and by the end of this year, we will be totally self-sufficient. We will be major exporters of energy. We will take in massive amounts of money. We will start paying off our $20 trillion in debt.
The Americans remained steadfast and withstood the price slump. The US fracking industry had proven itself surprisingly resilient. Alan Gilmer is a leading strategist in the Texas shale oil industry.
So how in the world has the break-even price been able to drop so much during that time frame? I think that it was the magic question that no one figured out when they made the decisions to not support the price or the production of oil. So I think that it's the game's changed. The production of shale is very strong in the United States, you know, starting at around $40 a barrel and going up. And it gets better every year. But right now, if we're at $45 to $55 a barrel, we're going to continue to produce more oil year over year.
US producers are still drilling for oil, engaging in large-scale fracking and raking in the profits. Saudi Arabia had underestimated the American fracking industry. The kingdom decided to shift strategies. Behind the scenes at the Ministry of Energy, Ibrahim al-Mohana had long served as an advisor to Saudi oil ministers.
The drop in price in 2014 and in 2015 was the result of several factors. The first was the increase in oil production outside OPEC, mainly American shale oil. The second factor was a slowdown in growth and the global demand for oil. And third, the OPEC countries didn't respond quickly enough to the drop in oil prices. They did not do what was necessary for the market to regain stability.
The entire Saudi economy was affected by the collapse in oil prices. For the first time in its history, the kingdom faced a record budget deficit of $98 billion. In Europe, fuel prices were decreasing. But in Saudi Arabia, they increased by 50%. The Saudi economy is now in the hands of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who wants to modernise the kingdom. The billion-dollar Vision 2030 project seeks to prepare the country for a future without oil.
Saudi Arabia is far too dependent on oil. That is dangerous.
The authorities have started to change their strategy, which depended on oil revenue in order to diversify our economy. Unfortunately, the reforms are not being accepted. No one wants to turn their backs on the energy sector. For 10 years, the kingdom has been trying to prompt a shift in people's mentality, which must happen for this new direction to succeed. But most of the population has not reached that point yet.
نيوم أكثر من 25,000 كيلومتر مربع من الإلهام لكل أفكارك الكبيرة.
But the effort continues. As a part of Vision 2030, the kingdom launched the NEOM initiative, a new megacity run entirely on renewable energy.
فيه رواد الفكر والإبداع لتبادل الأفكار وتحقيق الإنجازات.
OPEC embarked on a fresh round of poker. Saudi Arabia had hoped to force the US to capitulate, to no avail. Now the member states urgently needed to come up with a new strategy to raise oil prices. At the Vienna meeting, OPEC was determined to maintain its credibility.
And we had really a battle then for market share. And in a sense, you could make the argument that OPEC blinked first. Because in some ways they might have been better to allow prices to stay lower for longer, because that really would have put a squeeze on non-OPEC supply and US shale in particular. As it was, financial pressures became too great for them.
In what was called an historic agreement, the OPEC countries pledged to cut production to help raise prices. Nigeria and Libya were exempt to the cut due to unrest in their countries. In the meantime, the US had resumed its oil exports. OPEC's production cuts allowed the US to gain new market share. At the next round in Vienna in 2017, OPEC hoped to woo non-member Russia further into its corner and tip the balance against American shale oil. Russian Minister of Energy Alexander Novak attended the meeting. Until that point, Russia had never collaborated with OPEC. Many wondered whether they would reach a deal with the Saudis. Russia is also an ally of Iran, a rival of Saudi Arabia in the Syrian conflict. The geopolitical chaos had reached its high point.
Russia has a natural alignment with OPEC economically and diplomatically. There are very strong rivalries in the OPEC world, especially between the Sunnis and the Shia, and between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, although Qatar has now left OPEC. That's left room for someone to step in. Russia was a natural in that role. They have good relations with various OPEC countries, including the arch enemies Iran and Saudi Arabia. Given the conflicts in the region, Moscow is increasingly assuming the role of mediator. The United States has extracted itself.
Au moment où les États-Unis sont en train d'en sortir total.
For the first time, Russia and OPEC have arrived at an agreement to stabilize the market and exports. This is a first. We expect that these good relations between Saudi Arabia, Russia, OPEC, and other countries will continue, such as Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Oman.
Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Oman.
Oil and politics have always gone hand in hand. Russia had ambitions that went well beyond the new OPEC Plus agreement.
We shouldn't exaggerate the importance of oil in the geopolitical sphere. Politicians and diplomats must cooperate with one another on other important questions too. But oil and gas strategies play a major role in global politics, there's no doubt about that. Putin is head of the Presidential Commission of the Energy Sector of Russia.
The oil crisis has reconfigured the geopolitical landscape, resulting in surprising new alliances. In 1945, oil brought King Ibn Saud and President Franklin Roosevelt together. This time, King Salman of Saudi Arabia travelled to Russia to meet with President Putin.
In Russia, there are political forces that support the OPEC Plus agreement, with the government and the president leading the way. There are other forces that are categorically opposed to OPEC Plus, especially our oil and gas companies, which have an enormous production capacity. But our state is currently controlled by the president and the government, so the companies can't do anything now or in the near future.
OPEC went into the next round, but it seemed the